Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Maggie Nelson?
This is Maggie.
Maggie, what a pleasure to have you on the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking my call.
My pleasure, Paul. So great to hear from you.
How are you today?
You know, today has been a good day. So today I feel good. Today's been a good day. It's peaceful out here, and my partner and I managed to give each other each a few hours off of childcare to do some things, and it's about 90 degrees, as you know, and I don't know. So it's an okay day.
And these last 3 months, you've been in Los Angeles, and you have also been teaching, I think.
That's true. I taught until I guess the beginning of May, finishing out the spring semester, and it was great. I miss my students, but we weathered the storm, the online storm together, and yeah.
How I've spoken to a few people who have been teaching and who have been going through the whole Zoom world, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this way of trying to share. I don't know if one would say share knowledge, but try in some way to reach students. Do you find that it is something that you would even do under different conditions?
I think that, what's interesting about it all is that I think if you talked about it at the beginning, it would have seemed very binary, like does it or doesn't it work? And then now, as we both have been through several months of it, and as we now, unfortunately, plan a fall, probably, of it, where people we're thinking more with nuance and trying to learn from what has worked. I think connecting with people individually or in very small groups can work a little bit. The larger the group, the harder it gets. And, it depends if the group already has a sense of camaraderie or not. So a bunch of different things. I think there's something about, in addition to physical communication when we're all together, just the fact of presence and the nuances of individual facial movements or gestures. I think something else that's actually difficult, and I see this in my young son on Zoom, is that, when you're trapped in a box, normal fidgeting processes by which you just take notes or you look out the window or all of that feels very repressed. And so I think that there's a lot of, I think people, they start chat boxing, they start just looking at, you can tell that your students are reading their phone below the screen. It's a lot of, it's hard to stay focused. And so I think that in the fall I think that my classes were 3 hours, and I think in the fall I will teach, and we will do shorter segments at one time, let's just say.
It must be really hard because in no small measure, teaching is so much about reading signs, reading students' faces, being a semiologist of sorts. And
yeah, well, it was funny because we were working on their writing, and usually workshops are a kind of emotionally charged place where you're trying to chart if the student whose work you're discussing seems like they're going downhill and some kind of upset. But, you really can't tell on Zoom, so we would just keep going and keep talking, and people would just have to take care of themselves, elsewhere after the call was over, So definitely the emotional valence was kind of low, although in some sense that was all right with me, too,
Maggie, I read an essay of yours which I just adored by a writer I think we both love. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about her because it was such a beautiful essay. It was an essay about Natalia Ginzburg, and particularly about one of her essays, which is included in a slim, but I think pungent, powerful little book called The Little Virtues. And the essay you wrote for The New Yorker was about her essay Winter in the Abruzzi. And your essay is called Finding Moments of Calm During the Pandemic. And there's one line in it which I would like you to expand on, where you say there's a certain dull uniformity in human destiny.
Yeah, she says that.
She says that, of course. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I probably wouldn't say that, but
you wouldn't say that.
There is, sure, but I think that she's writing that essay for those who are listening who haven't read it. In exile from Rome during World War II, and the exile doesn't end well. It ends with the death of her husband upon returning to Rome by fascists. And but the exile is actually quite long. I'm not sure how long, but I think that it's over a year. And I think that when the quarantine began, for some reason, I just it was the only essay I could think about. I just kept thinking about it, and I brought it down from my bookshelf and read it. As I say in the piece, it's very short, so I read it, standing up in the kitchen while shepherding my son through second grade online, and I just felt moved to say something about it, both because I think it's such a beautiful essay that I wanted people to read, but also because, the New Yorker titled the piece The New Calm. I didn't title it that, but her piece is not really about a calm. She describes it as a respite.
Yeah, and you quote
period that,
and you quote that line by Virgil: "God has granted us this respite."
Yeah, so that's her epigraph for the piece, and her piece is just really about living through a time where, she's complaining, her husband's complaining about getting used to this small town life, and they miss their friends, but their children who are growing up in this environment and don't know and are slowly ceasing to remember how things were. They're saying, we like it here. We like going to the store and buying the oranges. We like these different things. And, the end of the piece, which is just so brutal, it's one of the most brutal moments I know in literature, is just when she says, me paraphrasing, little did we know that this respite would be, that we'd look back on it as one of the best times of our life, that directly preceded, events of greater horror than probably they even imagined. And it's, I think it's not analogous per se, but I think at that moment, at the beginning of the quarantine, it was very hard to know. Everyone kept saying, just be in the moment. It's very hard to be in the moment when...
Extremely, yeah.
When what you're when what you're fearing is, as they were, that essay is kind of about, okay, just be here in the moment in exile, but yet, they're fearing, reprisals from the fascists and which is precisely what came. And so... Yeah, but this is our quandary. In some sense, I think she's writing that piece because all of life is a respite before we know what befalls us, and therefore, if we can't figure out how to do something with the respite, then we can't figure out what to do with being alive in general, you know.
I have to read the last few lines of your essay where you say, I think I reached for winter in the Abruzzi because I needed this reminder. I needed its stern and tender fellowship, which is delivered to me today across 76 years and 6,331 miles, much farther than 6 feet away. That the essay brought me to tears was not new, but this time, rather than weep for Ginsberg alone, I wept for us all as we, too, bought oranges at Giro's and went walking in the snow. It's tremendous, Maggie.
Well, it's a trick of a writer to use somebody else's great words to stand on like scaffolding to get great effect, and her words are it's her phrasing to say, you know, it's her ending to say, we who bought oranges at Giro's and went walking in the snow. So I'm kind of just stealing it, but repurposing it, and I'm glad that you found it moving. Very, very moving,
tremendously so. And I'm probably not unlike you. I'm looking for what might be helpful in this moment, and obviously also thinking about all the books that people are turning to now, what one might call a whole pandemic literature. You know, in Italy, 60,000 copies of The Stranger by Camus was sold. I mean, it's just staggering. But here you are turning to this very slim essay, and since the time you wrote that piece for the New Yorker, what else has helped insofar that we can even use such language?
You know, the really sad thing about this time is that I have not had any time to read.
Right.
I have been
a mother.
I'm editing a book, and when I have time to myself, part of my working on my book is, at first I thought, I'll never be able to edit this book during this time. I'll never be able to concentrate. And then I just started doing it. If I had an hour here, 2 hours there, if my son was playing Minecraft on a 2-hour play date, something, I just started doing it out of a blind leap of faith that I would feel better if I thought about something besides the situation. And then now, I've been into it. So unfortunately, though, I feel like my book is due in September, and now that there's no time alone, I feel like I've had to work on it every minute that I could get. So I've really been sadly reading mostly myself, and it's been, but it hasn't been unproductive, but it's been a little. But my reading therefore has been off topic because I've been rereading things that are in relationship to this project, and I'm dying to read other things, and I'm dying to. It's difficult to. It's almost easier for me to edit or write in snatches than it is for me to read in snatches of time. So I'm looking forward to when that comes. But I've liked listening to the quarantine tapes and other things to hear what people are reading, and I think that this whole resurgence of the classics is totally fascinating. That seems to be a real thing that's happening everywhere.
It's a real thing that's happening. What's the book that you're editing and finishing?
I'm writing a book that is tentatively called The Myth of Freedom, and it is a little bit similar to a book of mine I wrote called The Art of Cruelty, whereby I take a really big, unwieldy word and kind of rotate it in the light of specific rings of action, I guess, as Francis Bacon would say. So
yeah.
So this book is about, there are 4 big chapters. One is about the art world. One is about drug experience and drug writing. One is about sexual freedom and the kind of post-Me Too, or moment, and the last chapter is about the climate and notions of freedom vis-a-vis climate. So it's a very large project. I've slogged through editing the sex and drugs chapters during quarantine, and I still have climate and art to go. So it's been, so like I say, it's not really topical. I mean, it's not topical per se, although everyone has been asking me to pontificate about things about freedom during this time. I don't find I have much to say at present, only because one of the many pities of the polarization of politics means that things become so stark and black and white, where you just have, people holding signs saying, one set of signs saying, your health doesn't trump my liberty, and on the other side you have people saying, your freedom is killing me. And that dichotomy, though it's very important to my book is an attempt to think beyond it, so I don't really want to reiterate more of the same kind of black and white versions of the issue. So,
well, Maggie, I feel I recognize you in the desire to remain aloof from taking sides, because I so often think of your work as a work that doesn't try quickly to ascribe meaning, but rather take time. I'm always haunted by this line in The Storyteller by Benjamin. He quotes Valéry, who says, "Man no longer works at what cannot be abbreviated."
My writing, now that I'm looking at my writing and editing it, just as a case in point, every time my writing is boring and dead and flat and screaming at me to edit it on the page, it's whenever it is drunk on seeming like it knows what it's talking about, or pontificating about something, or rehearsing some political point that we all believe in and doesn't need to be reiterated, so it's very much like once you purge that out of the writing, you can't be standing there in a you can't just be left in a kind of swamp of uncertainty, and that's why people like Wittgenstein or something are such luminaries for me, and that, they show me that it's okay to be in endless pursuit of clarity, because every time you make something clear, there'll be something else that you'll want to make clear, and it's not you don't need to fear that you will have nothing to say, so long as you are kind of still focused on this, okay, well, where has this fly gotten into the fly bottle, and how can I show it a way out? But that's very different from pontificating. It's a kind of activity about taking time till you get to something precise about something, and then moving on to the next thing.
Hopefully nothing will make you go faster.
The irony is, as you can tell by my speed in talking, is that I've been accused often of being a very fast person, but
maybe only superficially.
I think that's true, and I think that I love, I came up in poetry, and I loved, I love the New York School and Frank O'Hara, and a whole kind of Eileen Miles, and a whole school that was basically based on talking fast in public. That to me is my heart. But, one of the weird things about moving to California after living in New York for so long and loving the whole art of talking fast in public is that, very slowly I've had to reckon with the fact that is not my life anymore. I very rarely talk fast in public. And I certainly, with quarantine and not going anywhere for the next few years, I probably won't be talking fast in public anytime soon. And most of my time is spent reading and writing in solitude, which is very odd for my personality, but that is indeed how I spend most of my time, you know.
You once said that you learned a lot from dance about composing in the moment. Yes. Yeah. Tell me. I mean, what has dance as an activity at one point in your life taught you about writing and composing?
Well, I love dance, and I got very into dance in college, and I moved to New York after college, spending pretty much equal time trying to be a writer and being a dancer. And the kind of dance I was most interested in, I guess they call it postmodern dance, or, you know, the kind of dance stemming from the Judson Church legacy in New York. And a lot of that kind of dance and the way I was trained had to do with improvisation. And so improvisation, a lot of the time you spend in a dance studio, or if it's a performance, kind of sitting next to the stage, and you watch what's happening on the stage. You watch people dancing, and, you know, the way I was taught was that, you know, you kind of, you look and you analyze the body's moving, and then try and imagine what your body should do in this space. And then when you feel it or you see it, you know, you move into the space and you do it with your body. And then, of course, immediately after you do it, there will be unintended consequences, things you couldn't foresee, which have to do with what other people do based on what you do. I mean, these are very normal improvisational principles in space, but I think, you know, writing always feels like that to me. Like I'm looking at a space, I'm looking at a conversation, if it's in philosophy or, you know, in the art world or anywhere, and I kind of just am watching and listening and reading long enough until I feel moved for, like, what should my body go in and do? What gesture should it make? And then as soon as you begin to do it, you feel like, oh, that wasn't good enough, or, oh gosh, that bounced off of that person in a way that totally failed, or you feel like it was euphoric and exactly right. But it's a very performative model of writing, which gets us back to what we were just saying about pontificating, is that you don't have to worry so much. Like when my students read like Sontag or somebody and they say, oh God, she's so bossy, I just say, this is performance. You know, she got into the space, and, you know, in every book she just made a slice in the space with her, you know, with her words, saying, here's what I think needs to be said right now. And that's all you're doing. You're not, you know, anyone who aspires to a final word is obviously, you know, rich with self-delusion. So I think about that a lot with dance, and I think about it a lot with the relationship between a body contributing something in the space with others, and how that relates to a kind of life of the mind, and in what ways do our words, you know, I mean, it sounds cheesy, but in what way are they kind of dancing with each other?
But
even literally.
We had occasion once, you and I, to talk about the work and the person, really, of Wayne Kirstenbaum. And for Wayne, I think this performative quality, and also the reference to Sontag, is so deep. We write with our body. The stylus we write with is also the style with which we write. The way it's our gait, our way of walking through space, as it were.
Yeah, and it's also so. I mean, this is the chapter on climate in my book, is so much about, you know, how we feel about something, you know, is going to be, it's the modality by which we think it through. And I think, you know, in this time when a lot of people, I hear every day in the newspaper and the radio, and everyone's kind of throwing these things out there, like optimism is a choice. I mean, I think that maybe you were talking with Bill McKibben about hope. And, you know, I think I'm very interested in to what degree our kind of choices about our affective states, or choices about how to deal with our affective states, determine both our writing and the spirit of our work, and then how it moves in the space and how others react to it, you know. And it's you can't always go at it straight on by determining, like, I will be a voice of optimism, or, I know usually that doesn't work.
No.
But you have to, usually it fails, in fact. So I think I'm very interested in I'm not interested necessarily in choosing for myself as much as I am in analyzing. It goes back to Nietzsche, about like all philosophy being in the autobiography in some sense of its author. I'm very interested in the idiosyncrasies that make us think what we think and believe what we believe.
Is blue still something you think about?
No, not really. Although I have to say that book, its subject matter, which has kind of to do with divinity, alcohol, aesthetic experience, sex, and a few other things, I sometimes feel as though, at least in the book I'm writing now, that I'm just dilating on all of them in discursive prose, whereas that book addressed them all in a kind of poetic, speculative mode. But I think every writer feels like they have the same subjects, and they just
we come back
at them differently every time.
Variation on a theme. We come back again and again and again. I ask you that in part because one of my ambitions and aspirations is to bring you together with Imani Perry, who now is in the midst of writing her own blue.
Oh, fantastic!
And I feel like I need to bring people together who think about blue.
I think that's a great thing to do. And one of the sad things about writing and beautiful things, depending on if you're writing about something beautiful or painful, is that you can kind of burn out your response to something in a certain way. And I think that it's a very peculiar thing whereby I've written about a lot of things that frighten me. I've experienced in a kind of positive way a burning out of a fear response. I'm borrowing Sylvan Tompkins' idea of burning out a fear response. And then sometimes with the Blue Book, I kind of burnt out a certain aesthetic euphoria I had around blue, which has taken a while for it to creep back in. And I think it just became something I was over-identified with. But I just, actually just recently, I have been... I passed a blue house the other day on a bike ride with my son that had all blue bottles lined up in front of it, and I just felt like I was going to die of how gorgeous it was. And I made him stop, and I took a picture, and I told him I wanted to live in a house like that one day, and I felt it come back, and it was very beautiful.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad that I'm catching you at the moment when it's a return of the blue.
It's true. It really is true,
Maggie, time just flies much too quickly. In closing, I want to refer to a phrase that is in Bluet. It's an epigraph by Pascal where you say, "And were it true, we do not think all philosophy is worth 1 hour of pain." What does that mean? What does that mean? I love the fact that makes you giggle a little bit. It's wonderful. What does that mean to you now?
It's funny. I think that that book was written at a time when... that book is very preoccupied with the question of, to what extent can the words of others, this is where we started our conversation, to what extent can kind of the words of others, be they philosophers or poets or whatnot, be of real, actual sustenance to us in our pain. And I think I thought that quote was funny because the book Bluets is all about a kind of search for, the book is written from a narrator in a lot of pain, and she's searching through a lot of philosophy to find some company and some solace with varying degrees of success and failure. And I thought that the quote was funny because he's just saying, no, it's not. But I don't know what I think now. I don't know what I think now. Now I think I would have to shift out pain for anxiety, and I would have to rethink it through.
Maggie, we go from the pain to anxiety to a return to an interest in blue. I can't thank you enough for talking with me today. It's such a pleasure always.
It's my pleasure.
I have
You too, Paul. You too.
so many more questions for you, but I'll leave them for another time. Thank you.
My optimism is that we will get to address them all in another place and time.
We will, and in person now that we live in the same city. I send you a big virtual hug.
Okay, back to you, Paul. Take care.
You do too. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.